Hi, my name's Paul Baines. Welcome to Cranfield School of Management's Research Seminar Series. With me here today is Simon Harrop, from the CEO of an agency called Brand Sense. Simon, welcome.
Thank you.
Simon, can you tell me a little bit about your agency, what it does and why it's unique?
Yes, certainly, Paul. It's about understanding the relationship between consumers and the proposition that they buy into, whether it's a brand or a product or a service, and how the brands that we work with can make that relationship more deeply engaging and in a holistic way across all five senses. About 4 years ago, when we set the business up, we carried out one of the biggest pieces of research into this whole area, trying to understand from a sensory point of view how consumers engage with brands. And what we found is that actually the senses are much more in balance in terms of that relationship than traditional marketing spend has been focused. We found that there was a huge over-reliance on sight, words and pictures, really, and that's how marketing spend was traditionally spent. So we're really addressing that imbalance and working towards this opportunity that you can create deep emotional engagement using all five senses, and particularly that talks about sound and smell and taste and touch as well.
I mean, potentially this is revolutionary, isn't it? You could say, well, given how much expenditure is currently undertaken on site, are you advocating almost a complete shift in the nature of the pattern of spend?
It's a good question. Ultimately, yes, of course. I'd love that to be the case. I think it will be, rather than revolution, I think it will be evolution, because we're learning all along. I've been in this field for about 20 years, and I believe I've got a robust methodology. But to change the way brands think and marketing directors think will take time. Hopefully through things like this, we're getting the message out to the young and upcoming marketers who are seeing that this is much more a central part of what they do. But if I could persuade the big marketing brands to just divert 1% of their current marketing spend into this sensory field, I would regard that as a huge success.
But I mean, that's the point, isn't it? How do you go about making that shift? Let's picture for a minute me as a marketing director. Why should I shift? What are the compelling reasons for me to shift my pattern of spend from sight to other elements of the sensory approach?
I think, as well as getting the message out through forums like this, I think marketing directors are increasingly understanding the inefficiencies of the current model, which is really all about talk at, because of media fragmentation, because of the sophistication of consumers, the fragmentation of segments. How do we segment people these days is much harder. So they're looking at new ways to connect. There's this over-reliance on visual means that how on earth do we cut through and get to the consumers that we want? So we're looking at new ways of connecting, not only new ways of connecting, but also totally differentiated, which is the point that you made. Because what we know is that certain senses give us the ability to cut through and go straight to an emotional platform. And ultimately what we're really saying is that the purchasing decisions or the brands that we buy into, a large part of that is rational, but actually a huge underlying part of that is what we would call non-conscious or subconscious, and it's emotional. And it's looking for the triggers that can drive that emotional relationship between brand and consumers that what we do. So we have a methodology that starts with understanding that emotional space, helping to define it versus your competition, identifying where the white space is, if you like, and then identifying the sensory signals that can drive us into that fertile territory.
Okay, so if we're not looking purely at sight, so much at sight, and we're now looking at these other sensory areas, tell us a little bit more about what this actually means in a campaign.
Well, I think if you talk about things like sound and sight, roughly speaking, some of these senses are much more what we would call interpretive, and they go to the part of the brain called the cortex, where we're receiving those signals, we're interpreting them, and we're making a value judgment. Some of the other senses, like smell and taste and to a certain extent touch, they are more intuitive. And because they're intuitive, they tend to be more emotional. So, if you look at where we're currently spending our budgets, in truth, they're going more to the rational cortex part of our brain, and what we're looking for is that connection to the emotional. So those other senses seem to be an interesting place to explore. So that's partly the message that we're getting across. But it's also about orchestrating the whole thing. So if you can bring the other senses into play and orchestrate it so that it's a holistic total sensory experience, it becomes much more powerful. That sounds a little touchy-feely, but we've got some quite robust research behind it.
I can't envisage it yet, Simon. Can you give me an example of a campaign that you've undertaken where you've brought together these different elements?
I think I can. I think perhaps the better way of looking at it is just to take an example. And one of the examples that I use quite frequently is actually in the airline industry. About 10 years ago, Singapore Airlines set out to own a sense of Asia. And because they thought that was an integral part of their brand. And there's lots of emotionality, globally around what Asia means. It's that sort of sense of hospitality and service. And they wanted to interpret that. And what they've done is they've taken this to the nth degree. They've got a signature fragrance, it's all about the brand. They have their colour palette that's used on board the aircraft, in their waiting lounges, even down to the detail of the colours that the cabin crew use in their makeup. The flavours that they use are all driven from this sense of Asia, so the whole thing is totally integrated. And they did this about 10 years ago without even really thinking about it. They didn't have a sensory strategy, they just went ahead and did it. And it's fascinating from my point of view to see that they use the same aircraft, they use the same airports, the same lines and routes, everything else, and yet they're consistently voted number one. And I think this is what's driving it, this sense that when you go on board, the whole thing is a holistic sensory experience that just works and is hugely differentiated. And I think that's not a bad example of how it can work if you get it right.
Is it then the remit purely of a very large company like Singapore Airlines, or could smaller or medium-sized companies also take a sensory approach?
I think any company that's looking for a point of differentiation can benefit from this, and it needn't cost a vast sort of sum of money. You can do some quite interesting and quite specific things at a sort of micro level to create differentiation. Even if you like tactical things, to look at, if you're putting on a direct mail campaign, one of the things that we've been able to prove through some quite interesting research techniques in partnership with Royal Mail was that you can almost double the emotional engagement if, for example, you put smell or sound on a piece of direct mail. Rather than just having it as a piece of paper, you can actually put smell on paper, you can even put sound into paper, and that will actually double the amount of emotions that are created. We did some interesting work using fMRI brain scanning to show this emotional connection. Actually, the psychologists have a term that they call superadditivity, which is if you can measure the emotional connection created through one sensory signal, and separately you can say it's the picture on a piece of direct mail, and separately you can measure the emotion through the smell on a piece of direct mail, and let's say visually the emotional connection is X, through smell it's X. Well, interesting, when you put them two together you don't get 2X, you get 2.5, 3 times the emotional connection, and it's this superadditivity that they talk about. So really we're orchestrating it all and making it all work together, and you've got a symphony rather than, I don't know, the violins tuning up.